Now you've taken this, what used to be a one-directional cart path, and you're turning it into a two-way highway.
Hello, welcome to Grid Decentral. I'm your host, Peter Asmus, Director of Strategic Marketing at Uplight. And today I'm happy to have on the show Peter Kelly-Detweiler, author of this book, which I've actually been looking at this morning, Peter. And welcome to the show. Why don't you give a little introduction about yourself?
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here and to see you again. So I've been in power markets for over 30 years. At Constellation, I ended up heading their demand response group, where we by the time I left, we had 1,700 megawatts of dispatchable load that we could call, text, email, and have it shed within periods as short as 10 minutes or as long as, say, half an hour.
These distributed energy resources, in the old days, they were always viewed as a problem. But, now they're becoming also part of the solution. But there's still a lot of issues. And I know you have one idea that you really think will help, and that's a DER registry. Explain what that is and why is that important?
Sure, it's an idea that's been pushed by experts like Chris Hickman. He formed a nonprofit called Collaborative Utility Solutions. So if you think about today's DER landscape, we typically have some vendor like a Sunrun with, first with solar, then they add batteries. SunPower doing the same sort of thing. You have other companies like STEM managing batteries. You have Mosaic and PJM managing water heaters. So each one of them has its own sort of spoke and hub type of approach, where an ISO or utility may call upon them, and then they activate the devices. And so you have a situation where, looking across the P node, the lower voltage distribution utility might not know that an ISO is calling upon a whole bunch of devices, which are increasingly not just being asked to shut off, but deliver bidirectional flows across that low voltage system. So now you have issues around power quality, voltage, frequency, all that fun stuff. If you want to create something, let's also take an example. Assume vendor A goes out of business. Not easy to just transfer those assets to vendor B. And you have all these multiple parties, which are going to be regulators, distribution utilities, ISOs, vendors, all wanting to know what's happening. And so and it's very, very locationally specific. If you look at, for example, the California PUC study that they commissioned from Cavallo last year, they talk about what it would potentially cost to electrify all transportation in California. And they're looking at up to $50 billion. A lot of that is stress on the low voltage distribution system, and it's very location specific based upon thermal limits being exceeded in transformers and other local equipment just for various hours of the day. So if we had a situation where we knew what these devices are, how big they are, what they're capable of absorbing or releasing or not consuming, and that was something that could be overlaid onto the utility GIS maps. Now you have a situation where multiple parties, and it could all be, for example, privacy could be defined by each state entity who gets to see what, and all the access is permission-based, but the ledger's got the same system of record for all the data. Now you can create universal efficiencies, which otherwise we're going to create a Tower of Babel with multiple vendors. And I know this from experience. When I was running the demand response group of Constellation, the lack of uniform data, for example, some utilities had hour ending, others hour beginning for the same hour. Trying to create code for that kind of nonsense, it just defied any efficiencies. So if we want to build this thing and reach the maximum potential that DERs can offer, a universal registry is probably going to be a sine qua non.
Well, are you optimistic that this registry could happen within a certain time period, or what would be your ideal scenario with the registry?
Well, idea would be yesterday, but of course, so one of the challenges, you got places like New York Rev, Reforming Our Energy Vision, which started in 2016 and said to the utilities there, thou shalt become distribution service providers, right, and start to stitch together your various IT tools and some OT tools as well. And you've got California, which has been working on a lot of this for a long time. So asking them to rip out what they have and replace is kind of challenging.
Yeah.
The rest of the world, though, is still in the very nascent stages. And so we've had a number, CUS, not me, but Chris and others, have spoken to a number, well, almost all the regulators now in the various states who see the logic in this.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them do.
Mm-hmm.
Folks at that utilities commission level understand the value that could be created. I mean, you and I know that today's distribution grid is horribly inefficient because we size for that peak hour. If we ran airlines this way, we'd run airlines that everybody could fly on Thanksgiving for maybe less than $200 per flight anywhere in the United States, and we'd guarantee everyone could get on board. That's how the grid runs today, and the capacity utilization factor is declining. If you bring DERs into the mix at the right place in the right time, charge your vehicles during periods of low demand, send bidirectional flows for certain services at other times, enlist batteries, and so on and so forth, you could improve the operational efficiency of the grid. And that inefficiency right now is just gravy waiting to be harvested that could pay for a lot of these other issues that we need to address on the grid.
How do you view this evolving, this DERM sort of concept, and how important is it?
Well, it's a squishy term. I agree with you there. But ultimately, if you define it as a system which allows for the control of and situational awareness related to the activation of distributed assets, or even just monitoring them, so you know where they are and what they're doing, then
Right.
you actually create this sort of very broad universe. But if you also think about it, you need something that's quite substantial and robust that way. Take a utility like Pacific Gas and Electric with its 5 million meters and assume that it has a addressable water heater, an addressable air conditioner switch, a battery perhaps, an EV charger, some other devices. You could potentially have, in a place like that, 20 million devices that are capable of interacting with the grid. So now you've taken this, what used to be a one-directional cart path, and you're turning it into a two-way highway in terms of potentially billions of transactions a year for a single utility. So the DERMS, therefore, has to be capable of encompassing that kind of capability. And, the other thing right now with our loss of load probability planning and what we pay for supersizing the grid to make sure we don't have an outage, if you had a really robust DERMS, you could actually start to break apart end uses based upon the elasticities of them. Like, what do I really need to have reliability for, and what do I not need to have reliability for? And you could create a lot more flex on that grid edge. And that, to me, is where a DERMS needs to go and ultimately has to then take all that information. If you think about moving to control room, the professionals in those control rooms are human beings like everybody else. There's only so much information they can take in before they're overloaded. So part of the DERMS is going to have to figure out what's the architectural logic and what's the latency of the information that flows in so that we see as control room operators what we need to see. A lot of other decisions are actually, data is aggregated further out. Some decisions are automated at the grid edge. And therefore, we don't overload those control room operators, but there's enough information that keeps the human in the loop. So contextually, they know what's going on and can make those overriding decisions when they're necessary. So those sorts of pieces also have to be ultimately integrated into this system of systems, and it's got to be all of it cyber secure as well, because that's a huge risk. Or else we're going to do this wrong.
There's the control room, then there's the flexibility services. As you mentioned, bidirectionality, like EVs, for example, you can modulate their charging, even their batteries could possibly be used for the grid. And then the other part is just the prosumer engagement, engaging with these folks to enroll in these programs. Are you an optimist that all of this is going to work? I'm assuming you're somewhat optimistic, but how would you like to conclude? What's your final thoughts about all of this DER-centric future?
Well, the avoided costs are there, so the value's there.
Right.
The resources are increasingly coming into play. A Ford F-150, the little one's 3 days of average household usage, so there's a need. And then where I am really optimistic is generative AI. Very soon, it's going to be capable of ripping through this data and making logical decisions. If we didn't have that tool, this would overwhelm us. But I
True.
think that ability to model grids and decentralized decision making, certainly putting more of this capability in the hands of non-human entities, creates some big brother concerns, but I think it gives me the greatest hope for optimism is we're yoking our human minds with a tremendously powerful tool that we're just on the precipice of seeing what it can do.